The bouncer's fingers dug into her arm hard enough to leave marks she'd find the next morning. And Rhea Vance didn't scream she'd learned a long time ago, that screaming only made men like him grip tighter. She just stumbled, knees scraping the polished black floor of the velvet cage, her cheap shoes sliding out from under her while 300 people in that gleaming nightclub watched and pretended they weren't watching. A bruise was already blooming purple along her cheekbone. Her father's wedding ring, the only thing she had left of him, swung loose on its chain and caught the strobe light for half a second before it disappeared back under her collar. She was 27. Soft-bodied in a way the world had taught her to apologize for. Exhausted from a double shift she'd only taken because her mother's hospital bills wouldn't pay themselves. And now she was being dragged toward the door like a bag of trash nobody wanted to claim. Nobody stood. Not the men in tailored suits sipping $40 whiskey. Not the women who looked away the second their eyes met hers. Not the bartender who suddenly found something fascinating about the glass he was drying. Grayson Fell, the man hauling her across that floor, had run this club for years and hadn't once been told no. And he didn't have a single reason to think tonight would be any different. But here's what Grayson didn't know. Up on the VIP level, half hidden in shadow at a table nobody else was allowed to touch, a man had been watching the whole thing from the moment it started. He hadn't moved. He hadn't blinked. He'd just set down his glass with a quiet click that, somehow, cut through the music. His name was Knox Halloran, and the people who knew that name didn't say it out loud. He was 37 years old, dressed in charcoal that cost more than Rhea made in 3 months, with the kind of stillness that isn't calm at all. It's the stillness of something deciding whether you get to keep walking. He owned the building Grayson was dragging her through. He owned the block it sat on. He owned half the people in that room, and most of the ones who weren't there. And Knox Halloran had exactly one rule, carved into him by a grief he'd never spoken about to a single living soul. He didn't, ever, let the strong put their hands on the weak. So when Grayson reached for the door, when Rhea's frightened sob slipped out before she could swallow it, the most dangerous man in the city stood up. Now, before we go any further, do me a small favor. If you believe the way a person looks should never decide whether they get treated like a human being, hit that like button, share this with somebody who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss a story like this one. Alright, now let's go back to where this really began. 4 hours before her arm was clamped tight, Rhea Vance stood before the mirror in the cramped apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building in Baltimore, tying back her hair and telling herself that she only had to make it through one more shift. She'd never wanted to set foot in a place like the Velvet Cage, a nightclub where money flowed like water, and people measured a human being's worth by the watch on their wrist, but she didn't have any other choice. The truth was as simple as it was cruel. The overnight job cleaning and washing glasses there paid more cash than anywhere else she'd ever applied, paid it that very night, with no questions, no tangled paperwork, and that was exactly what she needed, when every dollar had to go to one single place. That place was hospital room number 214, where her mother, Colleen Vance, lay fighting a cancer that had eaten deep into her bones and had drained the meager savings the two of them had scraped together many months before. Each round of chemotherapy was a number that made Rhea's heart tighten. Each bill that arrived in the mail was a reminder that love in this world wasn't free. And she had learned that in the bitterest way, watching her account balance fall below 2 digits, while the list of things that had to be paid only kept growing longer. There had been a time when Rhea believed her life would turn in another direction. Once, she had been a promising art restoration student, a girl who spent hours bent beneath a yellow lamp, carefully bringing back each faded brushstroke on old paintings, a girl whose teachers said she had rare eyes and hands that knew how to listen to broken things. She had once dreamed of a small studio of her own, of afternoons scented with solvents and oil paint, of rescuing things other people had been too quick to throw away, because she had always believed that nothing was so damaged it couldn't be healed if someone was patient enough to truly look at it. But then her father died suddenly, after nothing more than a heart attack on a winter morning, and before the grief had even settled, her mother fell ill. That dream was folded away as neatly as a painting taken down from a wall and put into storage, still there, but no longer seen by anyone. She left school with only 1 semester standing between her and her degree, sold the restoration tools she had once treasured, and stepped into one hourly wage job after another, until she drifted into that nightclub like a piece of wood, carried to the end of the current. The only thing she never sold, never took off, even on nights when hunger made her hands tremble, was her father's wedding ring hanging from a thin chain around her neck. It was the last thing left of the man who had taught her that the value of a person didn't lie in what they owned, but in how they treated those who had nothing to give them in return. Whenever she was afraid, whenever she felt small and invisible in the wide, cold world, she would lift her hand to touch that warm circle of metal as though touching a reminder that she had once been loved without conditions. That evening, as she slipped on the shoes with worn-down heels and stepped out the door, she didn't know that the few short hours ahead would change everything. She didn't know that the place she thought of only as a temporary way to earn money would become the place where her life was broken apart and then built again in a way she had never dared imagine. She only knew that her mother was waiting for medicine money, that her shift began at 9 o'clock, and that she had to make it through one more night, just as she had told herself every day. Only one more night. Inside the velvet cage, Rhea learned very quickly that there was a kind of person who was invisible, and yet still seen, and she belonged to that kind, faint enough that no one remembered her name, yet still visible enough to become a target for cruel words whenever someone had too much liquor and too little kindness. The guests in expensive suits had a habit of treating the cleaning staff as though they were part of the floor, and with Rhea it was even worse, because her full figure was always a convenient excuse for people to toss out jokes that made her want to dissolve into the air. There was a man who whistled at her when she bent down to wipe up a spilled puddle of liquor. There was another who deliberately knocked a glass to the floor, then laughed under his breath and told her she ought to thank him for giving her something to do. There were people who looked her up and down with contempt in their eyes, then leaned toward their friends and whispered something that made the whole table burst out laughing. Rhea had grown so used to it that she no longer lifted her head. She only kept it lowered, finished the work, and folded herself as small as she could, hoping that if she was quiet enough, the malice would pass over without touching her. She didn't tell her mother about any of it. She didn't tell anyone, because she believed complaining wouldn't change anything, and because deep down, she had begun to believe the things people said. She had begun to think that maybe she truly deserved to be treated that way, a poisonous thought that crept into her mind a little more each day, like water seeping through cracks in stone. In that cold place, the only person who treated her like a human being was Maeve, the night shift manager, a woman past 50, with neatly cropped silver hair and unusually sharp eyes, a quiet woman who always saved Rhea a late supper, always assigned her to work in areas away from the most aggressive guests, and sometimes simply placed a hand on her shoulder when she caught Rhea secretly wiping away tears in the storage room. There was something about Maeve that made Rhea feel she wasn't entirely like an ordinary nightclub manager. The way she watched everyone in the room as though memorizing every detail, the way she always seemed to know trouble was coming before it happened, the way she sometimes disappeared into the office and came back out with the face of someone who had just heard something important, but Rhea never asked, because in this world, people learned that the less curious they were, the safer they remained. One night, while the two of them were resting behind the counter, Maeve saw Rhea holding a supplier invoice and frowning as she studied the signature at the bottom. Then she heard Rhea quietly say that the signature didn't match, that the line here hesitated and had been gone over again, instead of written in one continuous motion the way a real signature usually was. When Maeve asked in surprise how she knew, Rhea only shrugged and said that when she had studied restoration, she'd been taught how to read ink and pen strokes in order to tell an original from a copy, that a true hand always left behind its own rhythm, one no one could imitate completely, and that she could see the lie in a line of handwriting more easily than she could see it on a person's face. Maeve looked at her for a very long time after that sentence, longer than such a passing remark should have deserved, then slowly nodded and changed the subject. But something in her eyes had shifted, as though she had just tucked away a piece of information in some drawer to be saved for later. Rhea didn't pay attention to it. She only felt warmed by the fact that, for the first time in many months, someone had listened to her speak without laughing at her. Then she returned to her work, with no idea that the small skill she had just mentioned by chance, as well as the kind woman sitting beside her, would later become two links in the chain that would decide her fate in ways she couldn't yet imagine that night. While Rhea was beginning her shift that night, in another part of the city, Knox Halloran sat inside a black car parked outside a cold glass building, turning through the pages that his loyal accountant had just placed on his lap, with the tense expression of a man who knew he was bringing bad news. The velvet cage was one of many links in the empire Knox had built from nothing, a network of seaports, casinos, and real estate spread across the city, run more by fear than by contracts. For many years, that nightclub had sent money flowing back to him as steadily as the striking of a clock. But over the past several months, the numbers had begun to slip out of place. At first, they were only small amounts that were easy to overlook. Then slowly, they became gaps that couldn't be explained. Cash vanished from the books. Supply contracts were inflated. Shadowy transactions crept into places that should have been clean. And Knox wasn't the kind of man who believed in coincidence. He had handed the velvet cage over to Grayson Fell years earlier, a subordinate who had once seemed loyal and sensible. And that was exactly what made the betrayal, if there was one, more infuriating than anything else. In the world Knox lived in, he could forgive an enemy, because enemies were meant to stand against him. But he never forgave a man who had been trusted by him and then turned around to stab him in the back. People feared Knox not because he was loud or violent, but because of the opposite, because he remained absolutely calm even when making decisions that cost others everything, because he could look at a person and calculate both their worth and their threat in only a few seconds, because when he lowered his voice, the whole room seemed to lower itself with him. He was ruthless. No one denied that. He had done things that still came back to haunt him at night, had made those who deserved punishment pay in ways no one dared repeat aloud. Yet within that ruthlessness, there existed something like a private code he never broke, a boundary drawn in blood from some deep place in the past that he kept locked away. Because Knox Halloran was rich enough to buy an entire neighborhood, yet poor to the bone in the one thing money couldn't purchase. He had no wife, no children, no friend he dared turn his back on and sleep peacefully beside. He had only those who feared him and those who coveted what he held. And every night, he returned to that vast penthouse to face the silence of his own life. There was a name, a face, a girl's laugh that he didn't allow himself to think about for too long, because each time he did, the old wound began to bleed again. Something had been lost many years ago, something he hadn't been able to save even though, at that moment, he had been close enough to touch it. It was that helplessness from long ago that had forged the man he was now, that had turned the young man who once knelt crying beside a cold body into a man who would never again allow himself to stand still and watch the strong trample the weak. That was why, tonight, he didn't send anyone in his place. He came to the velvet cage himself, without warning, without spectacle, only walking in quietly, so he could see with his own eyes just how far Grayson had betrayed him, and decide what price the man would have to pay. And he had no idea that inside the nightclub he was about to enter that night, fate was waiting for him in the form of a girl the whole world had turned its back on, a girl who was about to make the old principle inside him come alive more fiercely than ever before. Knox entered the velvet cage through the back door, reserved for him, without a single word of warning, and within only a few seconds the news of his presence spread like a cold current of air, making the lower managers suddenly straighten their backs, while Grayson Fell went pale and tried to hide it behind a strained smile as he hurried out to greet him. Knox went straight up to the VIP floor, chose his usual table in the shadowed corner where he could watch the entire dance floor without anyone being able to see his face clearly, ordered a glass of whiskey, and quietly studied the way Grayson moved through the crowd, noticing every hurried conversation, every evasive glance, every small sign of a man hiding something. Rhea had been assigned to carry drinks up to the VIP section that night because another employee had called in sick, and she hated it, because the upper floor was always where the most dangerous guests gathered, the kind of people whose very gaze made her feel small, but she had no right to refuse. So she carried the tray upstairs with hands that were already trembling from exhaustion after many hours of standing. As she came near the table in the corner, a drunken guest staggered backward and slammed hard into her elbow, and in one horrible instant, she felt the tray tilt, the glass slip beyond her reach, and then the entire portion of ice-cold liquor spilled straight down the sleeve of the man sitting in the darkness. The whole VIP section seemed to stop breathing. Rhea clearly heard someone draw in a sharp breath, saw the face of the nearest waiter turn white, and she herself froze in place, her hand still gripping the tilted tray, her heart pounding wildly, because she had already realized who she had just spilled liquor on. She had seen people fired for mistakes far smaller than this. She had watched Grayson dismiss a girl simply for breaking a glass, and now she had just splashed an entire drink onto the man even Grayson had to bow and scrape before. So, following the instinct that had been beaten deep into her through months of being crushed down, she immediately lowered her head, drew in her shoulders, stammered out an apology, and reached blindly for the towel at her waist to wipe it away, her whole body tightening as she waited for the shout, waited for a hand to rise, waited for that familiar moment when the world punished her once again simply for existing. but the shout never came. Knox didn't move. He only looked slowly down at his drenched sleeve, then lifted his eyes to her. And in that moment, when he raised his head, his gaze moved over her lowered face, over her trembling shoulders pulled inward as though she wanted to disappear, then stopped for half a second on the wedding ring hanging from the chain that had swung out from beneath her collar when she bent down. Something passed through those eyes that were usually as cold as stone. Something very small and very quick. Not pity, but something closer to recognition, as though in her shrinking posture, as she braced for a blow, he had just seen an image he knew too well, a fear he had once witnessed on another face long ago. He raised a hand to stop the guard who was rushing toward her, a small but decisive gesture that made the man freeze in place. Then he spoke in a low, calm voice, so steady she almost couldn't believe what she was hearing, telling her that she was all right, that it was only a glass of liquor. Rhea lifted her eyes for a brief second and met his gaze, and what bewildered her most wasn't that he had spared her, but that she couldn't read in his eyes the contempt she was so used to seeing in everyone else in that room. Then she quickly lowered her head again, stammered her thanks, and turned away as fast as she could, without knowing that the man was still watching her back disappear into the crowd, and that inside him, something he had thought had died long ago had just stirred softly. Still trembling after the encounter in the VIP section, Rhea retreated into the back hallway that led toward the storage area to steady herself and put away the tray. And it was there, in that quiet place, cut off from the music, that through the narrow crack of Grayson's office door, she accidentally heard something she never should have heard. Inside, Grayson's voice was lowered but still clear enough, speaking to another man whose face she couldn't see. A deep voice, cold and full of authority in the way of someone used to giving orders, and they were discussing something Grayson called the debtor list. Rhea stopped short, pressed herself against the dark wall, and felt her heart pound as she listened to Grayson list names along with numbers and home addresses. She heard him laugh under his breath and say that the old and the sick were the easiest to handle because they were desperate and alone, that all you had to do was put a paper in front of them at the exact moment they were drowning in hospital bills, and they would sign anything without even bothering to read it. The other man answered in a satisfied voice that the beauty of the plan was that everything looked completely legal, that they signed willingly, that by the time they realized they had signed away their homes, it was already too late, and no court would defend a debtor who had put their own name on a contract. When Rhea heard that, the blood in her body seemed to freeze, because the phrase Grayson used next sounded terrifyingly familiar. He mentioned a medical relief fund, a program pretending to be a charity, one that targeted families ruined by illness and slipped papers into their hands promising help with hospital bills, but hidden beneath all that kind language was a clause transferring ownership of their homes. And with a horror rising into her throat until she could barely breathe, she suddenly remembered that only a few weeks earlier, her own mother had told her about a polite man who had come all the way to her hospital room, speaking sweetly about a fund that helped cancer patients. Her mother, in pain and desperate beneath the weight of all those piled-up bills, had signed several papers she believed would save the two of them. Rhea stood there with one hand pressed over her mouth to keep a sob from breaking out, as all the scattered pieces from the past suddenly locked together into one terrible picture. The small house where she had grown up, where her father had repainted the fence every summer, where her mother still dreamed of returning after she was discharged from the hospital, might no longer belong to them at all. It might have become nothing more than a name on the debtor list those men were talking about as casually as if they were discussing the weather. Then she heard the thing that turned her whole body cold. Grayson's voice read a name aloud from the list, and that name was Colleen Vance, her mother, followed by the address of their house and a mark showing that the file was nearly complete. She had to grip the edge of the wall to keep from collapsing, her mind spinning between fury and fear, because she had just understood that all the nights she had worked herself to exhaustion in this nightclub, sending every dollar back to the hospital, could become meaningless if even their home was being stolen by the very same people sitting behind that door. She didn't know who the cold-voiced man sitting with Grayson was. She hadn't seen his face, and she hadn't heard his name, but from the way Grayson spoke to him, she could feel that he was the one truly in charge, the man who stood even above Grayson in this dark network. And she understood that what she had accidentally heard wasn't some scattered little scam, but an organized machine swallowing the weakest people whole. She should have quietly slipped away. She should have pretended she had never heard a thing, but her legs had gone numb with shock. And in that very moment, as she stood frozen in place, a hand suddenly came down on her shoulder from behind. The hand gripping her shoulder belonged to one of Grayson's cold-faced men, a guard who usually stood watch at his door, and before Rhea could come up with even a single explanation, he had dragged her into the office, where Grayson was standing with a face that had shifted from smug satisfaction into the dangerous coldness of a man who had just realized his secret had been overheard. The man with the cold voice had just stepped out to make an urgent call, leaving only Grayson behind, and he slowly stepped closer to her, asking in a soft, syrupy voice full of threat how long she had been standing out there and what she had heard, while his eyes swept over her face, searching for any sign of a lie. Rhea tried to keep her voice steady, stammering that she had only come down to put away the tray and hadn't heard anything, that she was just about to go back to the floor. But she had never been good at lying, and the terror still stamped clearly across her face, after what she had just heard betrayed her more plainly than any words could have. Grayson only gave a dry, scornful laugh and shook his head, as though disappointed that she would insult his intelligence so badly. He stepped close enough that he was almost in her face, lowered his voice, and told her he didn't like people sticking their noses into things that weren't their business, that in this place there were things a person only had to hear wrong once to vanish without a trace, and that she ought to understand that a cleaning girl like her had words that carried no weight at all compared with his. Rhea felt fear rise until it nearly choked her. She shook her head desperately and began to plead again, stammering that she wouldn't say anything to anyone, that she only needed this job, that her mother was in the hospital and needed her. But the moment she mentioned her mother, her voice broke, and that trembling in her words only confirmed for Grayson that she had heard too much, that she knew about the list, that she even knew the name Colleen Vance, which he had read aloud only a few minutes before. Grayson's face darkened, and without a word of warning, his hand flew up and struck her across the face with such force that her head snapped to one side and she staggered backward into the shelving behind her, her ears ringing, her mouth bitter, tears spilling uncontrollably from pain and from the shock of violence that had come so suddenly. He stood there watching her crumple without the slightest flicker of pity, then said in a voice that had already calculated everything that now he would give her a proper reason to disappear from here without anyone asking questions. He would tell everyone she was a thief, that he had caught her stealing money from the safe, and no one in this nightclub would doubt the word of the manager to defend some nameless cleaning girl. Rhea lifted her eyes to him through her tears, understanding with a cold, hopeless horror that he had already set the trap, that slapping her was only the beginning, and that his plan was to throw her out in front of the crowd as a thief, both to silence her and to destroy the little credibility she had. That way, even if she later dared to open her mouth about that list, no one would believe the words of a girl who had just been fired for stealing. He grabbed her arm and yanked her to her feet, ignoring her pleas and the tears rolling down her face, then shouted for his man and ordered him to drag this little thief out of the club where everyone could see her. And as she was pulled stumbling through the office door, back toward the lights and the pounding music, Rhea only had time to lift one hand and touch her father's ring at her throat, clinging to that last small fragment of courage, with no idea that in the next few seconds, when she was dragged out into the middle of the floor before 300 indifferent people, there would be one person in that entire room who would decide not to turn away. Knox had risen to his feet, and the entire VIP floor seemed to sink beneath the weight of his tall shadow as he left the hidden corner and began descending the stairs toward the main floor, unhurried, one step at a time, his eyes locked on the sight of the underling, dragging the girl toward the door. He had recognized her at once, the girl who had spilled liquor on his sleeve earlier that evening, the girl with a wedding ring hanging from her neck and shoulders that knew how to curl inward while waiting for a blow. And now her face carried the mark of a hand that had just struck her. Her eyes were red from crying, and she was being hauled through the crowd like something to be thrown away, while not one person among those 300 indifferent souls lifted themselves to help. Knox had seen enough in his life to know when something was only an argument, and when it was the naked trampling of the strong over someone who couldn't fight back. And the sight before him cut straight into the one principle carved in blood inside his heart, making something cold and final rise up in place of his usual calm. When he set foot on the floor, the nearby crowd automatically parted like water before the bow of a boat, and it was the sudden silence spreading from him that made Grayson look up, made the underling pulling her freeze, and made Rhea, through the blur of her tears, lift her eyes toward the man coming closer. Knox stopped a few steps away from them, and in a low voice that wasn't loud at all but cut through the last remnants of the music, he said 3 simple words: "Let her go." The underling loosened his grip at once, by the reflex of a man accustomed to obeying orders. But Grayson was different. He had already endured a terrible night after having his secret overheard, and now he had been caught by his own boss in the middle of a filthy act. So in a panic mixed with bitter resentment, he made the greatest mistake of all. He chose to defy Knox. He forced out a smile and spoke in a voice trying to sound composed, saying this was only an internal club matter, that this girl was a thief caught in the act, and he was handling it according to procedure, that Knox didn't need to trouble himself over something so small, and could simply relax and return to his whiskey. But the moment those words left his mouth, Knox knew he was lying, because he had watched this girl all evening, had seen the way she lowered her head and apologized over a spilled drink, had seen in her the instincts of someone who was always afraid, not the cunning of a thief. More importantly, he had already heard enough about Grayson's dirty games that night to understand that the label of thief was only a convenient lie meant to hide something far worse. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He only moved his eyes slowly from Ria's swollen face to Grayson's paling one, then asked in a voice as soft as silk and as cold as ice how a thief had ended up with the handprint of the manager on her face. And that question hung suspended in the silent room like a blade. Grayson stammered, searching for an excuse, saying the girl had resisted and he had been forced to act, but his voice had lost its certainty, and the crowd around them began to feel that the balance of power in the room had just tilted completely to one side, in a way they hadn't expected. Knox took another step forward, now standing between Grayson and the door, between the oppressor and his escape, and he gave a slight signal for the underling holding Ria to step back, a small gesture, yet one that carried the full weight of the man who owned everything in that building. The man hesitated, then released the girl. Ria stumbled backward, clutching her aching arm, still unable to believe what was happening, while Knox never took his eyes off Grayson, and with the frightening calm of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed, he said that now Grayson and he were going to talk properly about everything Grayson had been hiding from him. And at that exact moment, the club's front door burst open. The man who stepped through the newly opened door was a man somewhere past 50, in a perfectly tailored suit, his graying hair combed neatly back, a politician's smile already fixed on his lips, and the walk of someone accustomed to having doors opened for him and heads bowed in greeting. The moment he appeared, Grayson, who had been backed into a corner beneath Knox's gaze, seemed suddenly to find something to lean on again. His shoulders straightened, and a crooked smile returned to the face that had just been pale with fear. Behind that man came a second figure, broader and heavier, dressed in plain clothes but with a police badge visible at his belt and a holster at his side, his face grim in the way of a man used to bending the power of the state toward purposes that were anything but clean. Grayson immediately signaled to his men, and within only a few seconds, the doors of the velvet cage were locked one after another. The music was cut off abruptly, leaving the whole room plunged into a silence stretched tight as a wire, with 300 people now trapped together in a space that had suddenly become suffocating and dangerous. The older man walked into the middle of the floor and looked around with the casual ease of someone who believed he controlled every situation. Then he stopped in front of Knox and greeted him by name, his tone polite but faintly condescending, introducing himself as August Price. Standing off to one side, Ria recognized him at once as the cold, commanding voice she had overheard behind Grayson's office door, the true head of the debtor list, the man at the center of the machine that was swallowing the homes of the sick. Price said he was a respected businessman, a candidate running for the city council, a friend of order and the law, and he introduced the police officer with him as Inspector Delaney Kerr, a man who, according to Price, was always willing to help resolve small misunderstandings smoothly. Kerr stepped forward and declared in a hard voice that there had been a report of theft inside the club, that he was there to arrest the fraudulent little employee, and that everyone simply needed to stand still and cooperate if they didn't want trouble. His eyes slid toward Ria with the threatening look of a man who intended to turn a slanderous lie into a lawful arrest in order to silence her forever. Knox stood motionless in the middle of it all, showing no sign of being shaken by the arrival of the two men, because he understood the performance unfolding before him at once. He understood that Grayson hadn't acted alone, that behind him stood an alliance between Price's money and Kerr's corrupted authority, and that the fact they had rushed there together that very night proved one thing clearly. The small, trembling girl had accidentally learned something dangerous enough that they were willing to mobilize an entire machine to erase her. Knox looked at Price slowly, measuring the man before him with the calm of a hunter recognizing his prey. And while the air between the two powerful men thickened until it felt as though it could be cut, in a shadowed corner behind the bar, a young bartender who had witnessed the entire scene quietly slipped his phone from his pocket, pressed it close against his body so no one would see, and began recording everything, from the locked doors, to the girl's swollen face, to the inspector's badge, as he used the law to shield a crime. The young man's hand shook, but he held the phone tight, because something in that moment told him that what was happening before his eyes needed to be recorded. Price, completely unaware of the electronic eye watching him, smiled and told Knox that he was an intelligent man, so he surely understood when it was best to stay out of other people's business, and that it would be better for everyone if he allowed Inspector Kerr to do his job and let them all return to a pleasant evening. But his smile began to stiffen when Knox still didn't move, didn't say a word, and only looked at him with eyes that had already decided something no one in the room had yet managed to guess. Knox held his silence for one more beat, long enough for Price and Kerr to feel that empty pause begin pressing down on them. Then he slowly spoke, not to Price, but to the inspector, in the calm voice of a man placing each chess piece exactly where he had already planned it to go. He said that before Inspector Kerr arrested anyone for theft, perhaps he ought to know that the manager who had just accused that girl had been embezzling money from this very club for months, and that Knox had proof of it in his possession. Knox drew from inside his jacket a thin, neatly folded file, the same file his accountant had handed him just before he walked in here tonight, and he lifted it just high enough for Grayson to see. Then, with measured calm, he listed several figures: the missing cash that couldn't be explained, the supply invoices inflated to twice their value, the transactions falsely signed under Grayson's name with shell companies, each detail read aloud with a composure so exact it was chilling, making Grayson's face grow paler with every sentence. Knox said that what he held in his hand alone was enough to prove the real thief in this club wasn't the girl standing there, but the very man who had just slandered her, and that if Inspector Kerr still wanted to make an arrest tonight, then perhaps the name on the warrant should be Grayson Fell, and no one else. Kerr glanced at the file, then over at Price, the confidence on his face beginning to crack, because he was a man used to bending the law for quiet little matters that left no trace, not the kind willing to expose himself in a room full of witnesses to protect a crime already backed by written evidence in black and white. Knox noticed that hesitation and immediately pressed deeper. He reminded Kerr that a police inspector putting cuffs on an innocent victim to protect an embezzler was the kind of thing that could destroy both the inspector's career and his freedom, that there were too many eyes watching in this room, and that Knox advised Kerr to ask himself whether August Price was worth losing everything for. That sentence struck the deepest fear of a corrupt man, the fear of being abandoned when everything came apart, and Kerr, after a brief glance between the stiffened Price and the unshaken Knox, made the choice of a man who always valued his own safety above all else. He slowly removed the badge from his belt, set it down on the nearest bar top with a dry, sharp click, muttered that he had nothing to do with this and that he had never been here tonight, then turned and walked straight toward the door, unlocking it himself, and stepping out into the night, leaving Price standing rooted to the middle of the floor. The inspector's retreat seemed to pull away the last support holding Grayson upright, and when the underling beside him also began to step back in confusion, Knox gave a slight nod to Shane, the loyal man who always followed him in silence. In an instant, Shane and several of Knox's men closed in on Grayson from both sides, twisted his arms behind his back, and pinned him down cleanly, without a single wasted sound. Grayson struggled, cursing and threatening loudly, shouting that Knox didn't understand who he had just crossed, that there were forces behind this far larger than he could imagine. But Knox only stepped closer, bent down to look straight into his eyes, and quietly said that he would be very pleased to hear Grayson tell him all about those forces, one name at a time, but that would come later. For now, Grayson would be wise to keep quiet. Then Knox straightened, turned his gaze toward August Price, who still stood there with his smile completely gone, and the entire room understood that the real confrontation had only just begun. While Grayson was being held down and Price still stood motionless, measuring the situation, a figure separated from the crowd and walked toward Knox with a strangely calm stride in the middle of the chaos. When Rhea realized it was Maeve, she thought the kind night shift manager was only another frightened witness like everyone else, until she saw Knox give the woman a slight nod of greeting, a gesture of recognition, and heard Maeve answer in a calm, professional voice that everything had been fully recorded and was exactly as she had reported. Rhea stood frozen, her mind unable to process what she had just heard. Because that sentence, the way Maeve stood upright and spoke as an equal to the most powerful man in the room, the presence so completely different from the woman who had quietly saved her late-night meals, all of it came together into a truth she didn't dare believe. Maeve turned to look at her, and in those sharp eyes there was both tenderness and an unspoken apology. Then she admitted what Rhea was slowly beginning to guess. That she wasn't an ordinary nightclub manager. That she was one of Knox's people, planted by him inside the velvet cage many months earlier, with the task of quietly watching Grayson after the numbers in the books began showing signs of irregularity. She explained gently that it was her steady reports about the suspicious transactions, about Grayson's secret meetings with strangers, about the increasingly dark atmosphere settling over the club that had made Knox decide to come there in person tonight, to see it with his own eyes and take action, and that his presence in this room, the thing Rhea had believed was an almost unbelievable stroke of luck, was in fact the result of months of silent preparation. For Rhea, that confession came down like a double wave, both a relief and a shock, because she had just realized that the only person who had treated her kindly in this cruel place had also been carrying a secret, that those caring gestures might have been only the cover for an operation. And for a moment her heart stung with the familiar hurt of someone the world had taught too many times not to trust kindness. But Maeve seemed to read that thought. She stepped closer and took Rhea's trembling hand, saying softly that it was true she had been sent there to watch Grayson, but the kindness she had shown Rhea had never been false, that she had watched her for many weeks and seen in her a rare decency in the middle of this mire, that the late-night meals, the shifts arranged in safer corners, the time she had placed a hand on Rhea's shoulder had all come from a real person, not from an assignment. She added, with a meaningful look, that the night Rhea had casually told her about her ability to read handwriting and tell real signatures from forged ones, Maeve hadn't treated it as passing talk, that she had remembered it carefully because she had sensed that a skill like that could become profoundly important in the fight ahead, and those words sent a faint chill through Rhea, though she still didn't fully understand their meaning. Knox, standing nearby, finally turned and looked at the girl completely, and for the first time that night, he allowed his gaze to rest on her long enough for her to feel the weight of it, not the cold, assessing look he had given Grayson or Price, but a different kind of attention, as though he was seeing in her something more important than the role of an accidental victim. Rhea, amid all the fear, pain, and bewilderment of that night, suddenly understood that her life had just been drawn forever into a world she hadn't chosen, a world of people wearing many layers of masks, where even kindness could walk beside calculation, and that from this moment on, there would be no way for her to return to being the invisible cleaning girl she had been before. After Grayson had been taken away and August Price, following one long, spiteful look toward Knox, was also forced to retreat through the now unlocked door because he knew the board was not tilted in his favor tonight, the whole room, which had been frozen solid in fear, began to stir faintly back to life. The strange thing was that it took only one man daring to rise among 300 silent people, only a single act breaking the spell of indifference, for courage to seem to spread through the air like something contagious. One by one, people began to move, as though they had suddenly remembered that they, too, had hands, feet, and voices. The young bartender who had recorded the video quietly put his phone away and stepped out to bring Rhea a glass of water. A middle-aged woman, seated at a nearby table, hurriedly pulled several tissues from her purse and handed them to Rhea so she could wipe her face. 2 male guests picked up a chair that had been knocked over and set it upright again, and even those who, only minutes earlier, had lowered their heads to avoid her eyes now looked up with guilt, as though Knox's courage had forced every person in that room to face their own cowardice. Rhea sat there, surrounded by unfamiliar hands, reaching toward her with kindness for the first time, and she broke down crying, but this time it wasn't from pain or fear. It was from a strange emotion she had forgotten long ago, the feeling of being seen as a human being and not as an invisible shadow. Knox walked closer, and the crowd automatically parted to make room for him. He didn't say much. He only bent down and quietly asked whether she needed someone to look at the wound on her face. A simple question, yet spoken with such gentleness that Rhea lifted her eyes to him in stunned disbelief, because she couldn't make the man who had just subdued both a police inspector and a powerful businessman fit with the man now worrying over the swollen cheek of a cleaning girl. She shook her head, murmured her thanks for saving her, then couldn't stop herself from asking the question that had been aching inside her ever since he had risen from the table in the corner, why he had done it, why in a room full of people he alone had been willing to act for a stranger who was nothing to him. Knox was silent for a long while, and in that moment his stone-cold face seemed to soften slightly, his eyes looking somewhere beyond the room, beyond even the years. Then he said, in a voice lower and rougher than usual, that once, a very long time ago, he had stood in a room full of people and watched someone he loved get hurt, and no one had moved, not even him, because he had been too young and too powerless to do anything. He stopped, his jaw tightening as though he were swallowing something bitter, then added that he had spent the rest of his life carrying the terrible feeling of being someone who had stood by and done nothing, and that he had sworn to himself he would never let himself become that person again, would never stand still when he saw the strong trampling the weak, no matter what price had to be paid. He didn't say who that person had been. He didn't mention a name or a face, but the way he closed the story there, the heavy silence after his words, told Rhea that she had just touched the outer edge of a deep wound this man had kept locked inside for many years, a wound that had forged the whole of the ruthless man he had become, and yet strangely, the man of unbreakable principles too. She didn't ask anything more. She only quietly lifted her hand to touch her father's ring at her throat, following the old habit of searching for comfort, and Knox caught the gesture, recognizing in her the same way of carrying the dead that he understood all too well. And between two strangers whom the night had forced toward one another, an invisible thread began to fasten itself from the very losses each of them still carried in silence. After that night, Knox didn't allow Rhea to return to her cramped apartment, because he understood better than anyone that August Price wasn't the kind of man who would spare a witness who had heard too much, and that this girl had now become a danger Price would try in every possible way to erase. So he arranged for her to stay in a safe apartment under his control, with his men guarding her and making sure she was cared for through every meal and every hour of sleep. For Rhea, being suddenly drawn into Knox's world was an experience both overwhelming and unsettling, because around her now was the cold luxury of vast rooms, quiet men with guns standing outside the door, and a kind of safety purchased through power that she couldn't make herself feel comfortable with, while her mind was always turned toward her mother lying in the hospital, with Rhea still not knowing how she was supposed to keep taking care of everything. She and Knox began having brief conversations, usually late at night when he stopped by to check on the situation, and through each hesitant fragment of dialogue, two people who seemed completely opposed to each other slowly began revealing their hidden corners. Rhea saw in Knox not a hero, as his actions at the club might have suggested, but a complicated and frightening human being. A man who had ordered things done that made her shiver when she heard his people mention them. A man who controlled an entire underground empire through fear, and sometimes through violence. She had to remind herself that the gentleness he showed her couldn't erase that ruthless nature, that she shouldn't let gratitude turn into something more dangerous. And yet, the more time she spent near him, the more she realized that behind that layer of ice was a loneliness so deep it made the heart ache, that this man who owned everything had no one he could truly talk to, no one who looked at him without fear or greed attached, and that she, a cleaning girl with nothing in her hands, was somehow the first person in many years who dared look straight into his eyes and ask him honest questions. As for Knox, he found himself surprised by his own heart when he realized that Rhea's presence eased something inside his chest, that he was finding excuses to stop by the safe apartment more often than necessary, that he caught himself listening to her talk about the paintings she had once restored, about the father who had taught her the value of a person, about the unfinished dream she had left behind, with a kind of attention he hadn't given anyone in a very long time. He knew it was dangerous. He knew that in his world, attachment was a weakness his enemies could exploit. He knew this girl deserved a decent life far more than she deserved to be pulled into the blood-stained orbit of a man like him, and so he tried to keep his distance, tried to appear cold and remote whenever he felt himself coming too close. But that very struggle created a quiet tension between them, a wordless temptation they both felt and neither dared to name. One night, when Rhea couldn't sleep because she was worried about her mother and had gone to sit by the window, looking down at the city lit below, Knox came and sat beside her in silence. She softly said that she was afraid that no matter how much power he had, she would still lose everything. Her mother, her home, even the person she used to be. And Knox, instead of offering empty promises, only quietly admitted that he couldn't guarantee everything would be all right, but he could guarantee that as long as he was still standing, no one would be able to touch her. That naked honesty, without decoration and without false comfort, made Rhea trust him more than any sweet words ever could, and at the same time it frightened her to realize that her heart was leaning toward a man her reason kept telling her to be wary of. August Price wasn't the kind of man who sat still and accepted defeat. And when he realized that confronting Knox directly in a room full of witnesses was impossible, he turned to the familiar method of the wealthy and cunning, bribery from within, trying to break his opponent through the very people closest to him. He discovered that there was one disgruntled man in Knox's ranks, a longtime underling named Doyle, who had always been jealous because he felt Knox had never trusted him enough to give him the most profitable positions. A man who had quietly accumulated resentment over the years, and Price approached him with a large sum of money and the promise of a higher place in the new order after Knox was removed. Doyle agreed, and he gave Price's people Knox's travel schedule, especially the fact that Knox often went alone to an old warehouse in the Port District late at night to inspect shipments, a habit very few people inside the organization knew about. On the night of the ambush, when Knox stepped into the dim warehouse with only Shane beside him, he immediately felt that something wasn't right. The silence too deep, the faint smell of gunpowder in the damp air, and the instincts tempered through years of life and death saved him when he shoved Shane down just as the first burst of gunfire tore through the darkness. A shootout erupted inside the cramped warehouse, bullets striking metal crates and throwing off sparks, Knox and Shane rolling behind a concrete wall for cover, and in the chaos Knox was grazed by a bullet across his left shoulder, blood soaking through his sleeve, a sharp, burning wound, reminding him that no matter how powerful he was still only a man of flesh and bone who could fall like anyone else. But he didn't panic. He fought with the coldness that had become instinct, tracking each sound to locate the attackers, and with his experience and Shane's cover, the two men gradually turned the tide, taking down several gunmen and forcing the rest to flee into the night. When everything settled, Knox leaned back against the cold wall, one hand pressed hard over the bleeding wound, breathing heavily in the warehouse, now scattered with spent shells and gun smoke, and the first thing he thought of wasn't the pain, but the chilling question of how the enemy had known exactly that he would be here at this hour when only a very small number of people knew that schedule. Shane, his face pale after escaping death, realized the same thing, and both men reached the same spine-chilling conclusion that this ambush couldn't have happened unless there was a traitor inside the organization who had sold him out. Knox had his people investigate quietly, following the small clues about who had known the schedule and who had made unusual contact in recent days, and in the end, every lead pointed to a single name, Doyle, the man who was brought before Knox the very next night by Shane and Knox's men. Under Knox's icy stare, Doyle denied everything at first, but then he broke and confessed it all, that August Price had been the one who paid him, that Price was desperately trying to eliminate Knox before Knox could expose his operation, and that Price had also mentioned Grayson as an important link now being held captive. One Price feared might open his mouth. Knox stood listening in silence, the wound in his shoulder still throbbing like a reminder of the ruthlessness of the enemy he was facing. And he understood that this war had entered a far more dangerous stage, that Price wouldn't stop at targeting him and would sooner or later go after Rhea and her mother. And that to protect the girl who had awakened something he had thought long dead inside him, he would have to end August Price before Price could strike first. When Knox brought back the files gathered from his sources, including the home transfer contracts Price's operation had forced the victims to sign, he spread them across the long table in the safe apartment, with the intention of having his lawyers review them. But Rhea was the one who noticed what no lawyer had seen. She asked to look at the papers, at first only because she wanted to find the contract bearing her mother's name. But when the eyes trained through her years of studying restoration moved across the pages, something began to make her stop, a vague irregularity in the signatures lying at the bottom of each contract. She asked Knox for a magnifying glass and a bright lamp, then sat down and bent over the papers in the very same posture she had once held for hours before old paintings. And in that absolute concentration, she began to read the ink strokes in the way only someone properly trained could, following the pressure and fading of the ink, the direction of the pen, the places where it hesitated, and the places where it flowed without a break, the private rhythm every human hand leaves behind when it writes. The more she looked, the more certain she became, and then she lifted her head and told Knox, her voice trembling with emotion, that these signatures were fake, not one or two of them, but almost all of them, that they had been made by tracing from an original signature sample, rather than written by the victim's own hands. She explained that a real signature always had a natural variation in speed and pressure, places where the pen moved quickly and places where it pressed down according to unconscious habit, while traced signatures always carried a forced kind of evenness, a very slight tremor along the curves, because the forger had to slow down to follow the sample line, and once a person knew how to look, those signs appeared as clearly as daylight. She turned to the contract bearing Colleen Vance's name and showed Knox that her mother's signature here was fake too, that she knew her mother's handwriting better than anyone on earth, and she was certain her mother's hand had never written that line. Perhaps her mother had signed some paper believing it was an application for assistance, only for that real signature to be used by them as a model to reproduce across one home-stealing contract after another, contracts she had never even seen. That discovery changed the entire situation, because, until now, the evidence Knox held was enough to stop Price for one night, but still not enough to bring him down before the law, since every contract carried what appeared to be a valid signature, and Price could always deny everything by claiming the victims had signed willingly. But now, if they could prove those signatures had been fabricated, the entire legal shell he had worked so hard to build would collapse, turning transactions that had seemed clean into evidence of an organized crime built on forged documents. Knox looked at the girl bent over the pile of files, her eyes bright with a belief and determination he had never seen in her before, and for the first time he realized she wasn't a weak victim who needed him to shelter her, but a person who possessed a weapon that neither his power nor his money could buy, an eye that could see through the lies hidden in every stroke of ink. Rhea, who had spent her whole life being taught that she was useless and invisible, felt for the first time that her hands truly mattered, that the skill she had thought had died with her unfinished dream had now become the key to saving her own mother and dozens of other people. She lifted her eyes to Knox and said firmly that she wanted to be the one to expose August Price, that she wouldn't sit still and hide behind walls waiting for someone else to save her anymore. And in that steady gaze, Knox saw a girl entirely different from the one who had once been dragged across the dance floor that night. Just as the evidence was finally in their hands, a call from the hospital struck like a blow, reporting that Colleen Vance's condition had suddenly taken a dangerous turn, and when Rhea rushed to the hospital room in a panic, she learned news even more horrifying than her mother's illness itself. The insurance package covering Colleen's treatment had just been canceled for reasons no one could explain, causing the medication regimen that was keeping her alive to be cut off halfway through. Rhea nearly collapsed when she understood that this wasn't some random administrative error, but a calculated act of revenge, and that instinct was confirmed by Knox when his people traced it back and found that August Price, through his tangled connections in the insurance and medical worlds, had interfered to cut off Colleen's medication. A brutally silent message sent to Rhea that as long as she kept fighting him, her mother's life would be the price. This was a race against time in the most literal sense, because every hour that passed without medicine was another hour Colleen grew weaker, and Rhea stood trapped between the cruel choice of giving up the evidence to save her mother, or continuing a fight that might cost her mother's life. While Knox urgently used every resource he had to restore the medication supply and stabilize Colleen's condition before it was too late. In the middle of that crisis, Knox decided it was time to force Grayson to talk, and in the room where the man was being held, under the pressure of evidence slowly closing in around him and the fear that Price would have him killed to silence a loose end, Grayson finally confessed everything in the hope of saving himself. He admitted that August Price was the one who had ordered Colleen's insurance cut off, that Price stood at the head of the entire operation stealing homes from the sick, and that he was willing to kill without hesitation to protect his filthy empire. But then Grayson added something that made the whole room seem to freeze, a detail that slipped out while he was trying to prove the depth of Price's cruelty. He said Price had been running this game of taking homes from desperate people for more than 13 years, that back then he had still been a loan shark hiding behind a respectable face, and that one of the families he had driven to the edge that year had been completely destroyed, a family with a young girl who couldn't bear the persecution and humiliation and had taken her own life. Knox, standing silent in the corner of the room, suddenly felt as if the ground had collapsed beneath his feet, because every detail in Grayson's story matched with terrifying precision the tragedy he had buried for 13 years, the sister he hadn't been able to save, the family crushed by a ruthless lender until they lost both their home and their dignity during that very same time. He stepped forward, seized Grayson by the collar, and in a hoarse voice demanded the name of the lender from that year, and when Grayson, trembling, confirmed that it had been August Price, that Price had often bragged about his brutal early schemes as though they were trophies. Knox released him and stepped back, his whole body motionless while a storm sealed inside him for 13 years suddenly broke open. The man who had destroyed his sister, the man who had driven that girl to the death Knox had carried through his whole life like a wound that would never heal, the nameless man he had hated in helpless fury for all those years, had turned out to be August Price, the same man who was now once again raising his cruel hand against a sick mother and a girl Knox had sworn to protect. And in that moment, the fragile line between justice and revenge that Knox had held steady for so long began to crack, as the blood hunger inside him rose more violently than anything his reason could restrain. Knox stood there with 13 years of rage boiling through his veins, and for one breathless, endless moment, everything inside him pointed toward one thing only: finding August Price and ending with his own hands the man who had destroyed his sister, the man who was now threatening the woman he didn't want to lose again. He had already given the order to prepare. He had already started toward the door with the face of a man about to do something from which the rest of his life would never be able to turn back. And it was at that moment that Rhea stopped him, standing between him and the door with eyes still red from the hours she had spent at her mother's hospital bedside. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She only looked straight at him and said she knew how deeply he was hurting, that she understood how enormous that loss was because she herself was standing on the edge of losing the only loved one she had left. But she was asking him to stop and listen to her before he walked through that door. She told him that if he went and killed Price, Price would die. But along with him would die the man Knox had struggled to preserve all these years, the part of him that had stood up in a room full of indifferent people to save a strange girl, the part that had made her believe that behind that layer of ice, there was still a heart capable of hurting for someone else. She said his sister didn't need a corpse in order to rest in peace. She needed the truth brought into the light. She needed the world that had turned its back on her all those years ago to look directly at what Price had done, and that the most powerful revenge wasn't dragging Price down to the level of his darkness, but forcing him to stand beneath the light of justice so the whole city could see what kind of man he truly was. She reminded Knox that they had everything they needed now. The video the young employee had recorded that night, clearly showing Price's and Kerr's faces along with the locked doors, Grayson's testimony, and the evidence of the forged signatures that she herself had uncovered. They didn't need blood to win. They could destroy Price in a way that made him lose everything, and still have to live long enough to witness his own collapse. Knox stood motionless, his breathing heavy, and in his eyes there was a violent struggle between the old man who had survived half his life through violence and the new light this girl had somehow kindled inside him. Then, very slowly, he realized that if he killed Price, he would forever lose the right to look into Rhea's eyes without being disgusted by himself, that she was offering him a chance no one had ever offered him before, a chance at redemption not by becoming even more ruthless, but by choosing another path for the first time. He loosened the fist he had clenched tight, and in that slight nod was an entire surrender to the feeling that had softened a man everyone had believed could never be moved. They began acting Rhea's way, and the machine Knox commanded was redirected, not toward bloodshed, but toward bringing the truth into the light. The complete files on the home-stealing operation, the video from the night at the club, Grayson's testimony, and the analysis of the forged signatures were gathered into a full body of evidence, then sent all at once to honest prosecutors, investigative journalists, and federal agencies beyond Price's reach. When every piece was made public at the same time, August Price's seemingly untouchable empire collapsed within only a few days. His partners rushed to turn their backs on him. The people he had once bought began competing to testify in order to save themselves. And one morning, in front of the media cameras he had once used to polish his name, August Price was led away in handcuffs under broad daylight. The face that had always worn a politician's smile now twisted by the realization that this time, neither money nor connections could save him. Knox stood at a distance and silently watched it happen, and for the first time in 13 years, he felt that the wound inside him was no longer bleeding, not because Price was dead, but because the truth had finally been told. Beside him, Rhea gently placed her hand over his, a quiet gesture saying that both of them had just been freed from something that had held them captive for far too long. I noticed that there is a safety note attached by the system at the end of this message. To reassure you, the story we're writing is a work of fiction, and the ending I'm about to write has been handled carefully to convey the character's tragedy in a humane way, without going into harmful details. in exactly the YouTube and advertiser-friendly spirit you requested. Below is part 18. When the truth was fully brought into the light, the greatest miracle wasn't the collapse of August Price, but what happened afterward. Because once the story was exposed, one victim after another began stepping out of the darkness. The elderly, the sick, the families whose homes had once been stolen in silence and humiliation, now finding the courage to speak when they learned they weren't alone. An old man who had lost the house he had lived in his whole life. A widowed woman who had signed the fateful paper in a moment of desperation. One person after another rose to their feet, just as courage had spread through the club that night, and it was those testimonies that closed every door of escape Price might have had before the law. The forged contracts were declared invalid. The small house where Rhea had grown up, where her father had repainted the fence every summer, was returned to the rightful owner's name, and more important than anything, the medication for Colleen's treatment was restored in time, thanks to Knox's intervention, so that after those critical days, her condition gradually stabilized again, and she could hold her daughter's hand and smile once more. As for Knox, the man who had once ruled through fear, began a transformation that was slow, but real. He didn't become a saint overnight, because his past couldn't be erased by a single decision, but he began dismantling the darkest parts of his empire, turning the enormous power and resources he held toward protection, instead of exploitation, quietly helping the vulnerable people he might once have never bothered to look at, as though every good deed were one brick he was laying down to rebuild himself. And then, on one peaceful afternoon, when golden sunlight poured through the windows of the house that had been returned, Knox came to visit, and Rhea stepped out to greet him, no longer the girl who had once curled inward waiting for a blow, but a woman who had found her own worth again. Remember how this story began, with a rough hand clamping around her wrist and dragging her across the floor, while 300 people turned their faces away. And now, standing on the porch in the gentle evening light, another hand reached for hers, this time not gripping hard, but holding it tenderly, not pulling her toward the darkness, but taking her hand, like a promise that she would never have to face this world alone again. Two people carrying wounds that had seemed impossible to heal, a girl whom the whole world had taught to believe she was invisible, and a man imprisoned by the past in his loneliness, finally found in each other what money, power, and endurance had never been able to give them: the chance to be seen, to be cherished, and to be loved exactly as they were. This story, ladies and gentlemen, leaves us with a lesson both simple and profound: that a person's value never lies in appearance, body shape, status, or the amount of money in their pocket, but in the inherent dignity every human being is born deserving to have respected, and that sometimes it takes only one person daring to stand up in the middle of a silent crowd to rekindle courage in everyone else. It reminds us that kindness and respect for the vulnerable have never been small things, that every time we choose not to turn away from injustice, we are helping make this world a little kinder. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share the video so we can spread meaningful stories together and bring you more compelling videos every day. How do you feel about this story? And what does it remind you of in the real life around you? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings from deep within your heart, because we're always hoping to hear what is in yours. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.